Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. It's been almost 13 weeks since the war in West Asia has begun. We have had multiple discussions on the various aspects of the war in All Things Policy. In today's episode, we will be looking into the naval and operational challenges due to the effective blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Anisree Suresh, Research Associate at the Takshashila Institution, and my colleague Adya Madhavan is here to take us through the various naval and operational challenges posed by the crisis in the region. Welcome, Adya. With the recent escalation in the West Asia leading to Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz and the US launching a blockade, what exactly makes this specific choke point so vital to global markets? I think even the Strait of Hormuz carries around, or used to carries around a quarter of global seaborne oil trade. So it's a very important one. And what is happening right now? Could you give us an update about this?
Okay. Firstly, it's funny because before the war, there was very little talk about the Strait of Hormuz, but the war in West Asia has made it front and center to global politics. Basically, on the 2nd of March, Iran officially closed the strait in response to the air campaign that America and Israel were carrying out. And after peace talks that were brokered by Pakistan and Islamabad fell through on the 12th of April, the US then announced their own blockade of Iranian ports, which was some attempt to choke Iran's exports. The Strait of Hormuz is important because it's the only maritime exit for as much as 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas, as well as other things, especially like agricultural fertilizers, urea, petrochemicals such as methanol. And the impact of the closure of the strait has shaken global markets and created a supply crunch for all of these commodities. Like, for example, in 2025, approximately 20 million barrels of petroleum and crude oil pass through the waterway every day. And now that that's not happening, countries are having to rely on their reserves, and globally prices have gone up in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're looking at India's situation also, we have been facing that energy crunch for a while for the last couple of months. Now, let's focus more on the strait itself. The physical layout of the strait is notoriously challenging, right? How do its unique depth, high salinity currents, and even local weather patterns create tactical headaches for naval forces and submarines operating there?
So the strait stretches between Iran on the north and the Musandam Peninsula, which belongs to Oman, and the UAE towards the south. I think it's around 97 kilometers at its widest part, which is right in the middle where ships pass through. And the narrowest part is just 39 kilometers. The thing is, the narrowest segment falls within the territorial waters of both Oman and Iran, because of which there's this traffic separation scheme that they use to streamline traffic. This has these two lanes and a buffer zone on either side. The inbound lane on one side goes through Oman's waters, and as soon as the ships pass through the strait, the geography forces them into Iran's coast. Iran is able to exercise control over the coast because the strait has these 7 islands: Abu Musa, Greater and Lesser Tunb, Hengam, Keshm, Larak, and Hormuz. I feel like I'm butchering the pronunciation of all of these. Okay, so just to our listeners, I apologize. And Iran basically has set up these facilities on all of these islands, which then allows them to monitor and control the shipping lanes because they go so close by to them. And Iran's coastline itself near the strait rises from these flat beaches up to the Zagros Mountains, because of which they can use the ridges and the elevation to deploy anti-ship cruise missile batteries, which allows them to have some sort of leverage and control. Compared to other choke points, interestingly, Hormuz is relatively deep. Like the Suez Canal, for instance, has a maximum depth of about 24 meters, and the Strait of Malacca's shallowest section is about 25 meters. But the thing is, because Hormuz is less shallow constrained, a blockade of the strait is much harder to sustain purely through geography. So, although the thing is, parts of the strait are deep enough for the ultra large crude carriers or ULCCs, the depth and water properties make it very difficult for navies to operate in on their own. Most of the strait is shallower than 80 meters, which makes it very difficult for large submarines since they need to be at least 45 meters deep at a minimum. For them, at a depth of below 80 meters, they can risk hitting the seafloor or they can risk hitting tankers. And because of that, they cannot operate in many parts of the strait. The hydrology also means that these submarines can't dive deeper for concealment, because of which Iran has to use these smaller submarines, such as the Ghadir and Fateh class submarines, because they're the only things that can navigate the shallower parts of the strait.
So, Adi, there is also a fundamental legal battle underpinning this entire conflict, right? Like, there's a core disagreement between the US interpretation of the transit passage and Iran's insistence on innocent passage. So, what is this core element behind this? Like, can you explain that?
Okay, so before we come to the legal challenges, apart from the geography, the water itself harbors these many, many challenges. For example, there's a lot of salt content in the Gulf, because of which there's these underwater heat currents that then have the ability to distort passive sonar. So submarines have issues detecting ships on the surface unless they go really close and close to high and close to the surface, which means they're very vulnerable to anti-submarine patrols. Then on top of that, the currents are also very volatile. And there's these traditional contact mines that would normally be moored to the ocean floor. But now, because of the currents, the mines in the Strait of Hormuz can then detonate upon contact with even civilian ships or the forces that laid them, for that matter. On top of which, the strait is hot, it's humid, there's a lot of dust content. And there are these evaporation ducts at the surface of the water, which then make it difficult for radar and radio waves as well. So missile radar seekers can be confused, sonar is difficult. Then with the currents, there's a lot of clutter. So it's very difficult to navigate. Coming to the part you said about international law. So a lot of the anxiety that comes about the Strait of Hormuz, even before, everything that's happened in the last couple of months, stems from these different ideas that the US and Iran have of the interpretation of international law. So the US and many of the major players in the Persian Gulf, for that matter, follow something called UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which basically says that the strait should allow the right to transit passage, which means any civilian military ships, aircraft should all have guaranteed access to the strait, and nobody should be able to suspend that access. But Iran says instead that this regime of so-called innocent passage should be in place. This means that coastal states, which in this case is Iran and Oman, should have the power to exercise their own discretion and have this degree of control. So when it comes to passage, they should be able to restrict access to parts of the strait for security reasons, since Iran says it's close to its own coastline. Iran has also signed UNCLOS, but hasn't ratified it. And the US has neither signed or ratified it, but they talk about how it's the customary international law. And because neither country has ratified it, then it's really hard to impose either of the ideas of what international law in the region should be.
That's really funny at a very funny, as well as it's a very difficult situation for I think international law. But I think if you look at it, reports indicate that over 90% of Iran's largest traditional naval vessels have been destroyed or degraded over the last month, right? So if their main fleet is heavily crippled, how is Iran still managing to effectively hold the shipping lanes at risk using asymmetric tactics like mines and drones and all those kind of things?
So interestingly, when President Trump attacked the Strait of Hormuz and attacked Iran and all these air campaigns were carried out, I think Israel and the US thought that just by destroying Iran's larger frigates and ships and tankers and all of that, they would be able to effectively cripple their capability to control the strait. But the way the Iranian Navy is structured, it's much harder to do that. So they split their assets and their operations between the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, IRIN, and the IRGC Navy. So the IRIN is this blue water force that, patrols the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman. And these are the people who use the larger platforms. They have the frigates and the corvettes and the submarines. But the IRGC Navy that operates within the strait and the Persian Gulf, They use things like smaller, fast attack ships and naval mines and shore-based anti-ship missiles, all of which allow them to have smaller, more decentralized operations. And actually, before American and Israeli strikes, Iran's fleet had, I think, 7 frigates, 3 corvettes, I think 25 plus submarines, as well as hundreds of fast boats that the IRGC had. In addition to which, I think Iran is supposed to have an inventory of about 5,000 naval mines between these two services. Interestingly, in 2007, these naval forces were reorganized so there'd be less overlap between what they did. And it's because of that partially that the IRGC Navy then focuses on the areas inside of the Gulf primarily. So although much of Iran's so-called conventional naval capability has been destroyed, this is a primary actor, the IRGC Navy, which then, of course, they're supported by the IRI and submarines and coastal defense cruise missiles in the Gulf of Oman and all of that. But despite the fact that their large vessels are supposedly out of commission or destroyed or, hiding in civilian ports for now, they can use these asymmetric forces such as shore-based missiles. They've also been jamming GPS. They've been using drones, so-called smart mines, to then control shipping routes through the strait. And because of this, with their geography, it makes it much easier. So, for instance, one of the things they've been using are they use these small fast attack boats, and then they use them in collaboration with explosive drones, which is enough to terrorize a lot of merchant vessels because they don't want to risk being struck. On top of that, there's speedboats, which are then equipped with these rocket launchers, and they can harass the tankers as they pass. And a lot of these tankers are civilian or they're run by commercial shipping companies, and they're not equipped to deal with all of this. On top of that, Iran has these Ghadir-class submarines, they're midget submarines, which are tiny comparatively, and they're small enough to navigate some of the shallow parts of the strait, and they can also be used to lay mines in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, because of which they're able to use relatively low weapons payloads, but still threaten a disruption of traffic. And although, for example, Iran's lead Fateh submarine, which was one of their bigger submarines, was sunk last month, according to US CENTCOM, they still have enough smaller and more attritable things like these drones to be able to control areas of the strait.
But on the other hand, if you look at it, the US Navy's Fifth Fleet isn't the only force in the region, right? So you have other regional players like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, all in the region and securing the waters. So what are the actual roles and strategic stakes of these regional players, especially in securing the waterway in the region?
Okay, so before we get the others, of course, you mentioned the US Navy Fifth Fleet, which is one of the major players. It's the Fifth Fleet of the US Navy is based in the naval support activity in Bahrain, and it's basically, I think, effectively, although they say it has many other purposes, it's the US's way to try and counterbalance Iran's forces in the region.
Yeah.
It essentially is responsible for as much as 2.5 million square miles of sea, and that includes Hormuz, of course, but Bab el-Mandeb and Suez as well. The Navy has carrier strike groups that are usually centered around something like a Ford-class nuclear carrier, for example. And then they have several aircraft of various kinds. They also supposedly have between 2 and 4 Arleigh-Burke-class guided missile destroyers. And they also have patrol craft, unmanned system task force called the Task Force 59, and fast attack submarines. This is usually their regular rotation of the kind of craft that they have. They may have a larger fleet now because of the ongoing blockade. Then apart from the US, there's the Saudi naval forces. The Saudi Navy has these 2 fleets, and the Eastern Fleet operates in Hormuz. It's headquartered in Jubail, and it operates within the Persian Gulf, of course. The Saudi Navy, their major role is to protect Saudi's oil exports through the region. And they export a lot of the tankers that depart from the terminals in the strait. Saudi Arabia has the single largest share of crude oil and condensate that passes through the strait. I think it's as high as 37% of the total amount that goes through the strait. And because of that, of course, their stakes are high. The Saudi Navy is currently in the process of modernizing, so they have a lot of older frigates and corvettes, but they're also acquiring newer platforms, I think. They have these Al Jubail class corvettes from this one Spanish company and a couple of things from Lockheed Martin and all as well. Then there's the UAE's Navy. And compared to a lot of the other Gulf states, except Saudi Arabia, they're relatively modern and capable. A lot of the Gulf states, because they don't have much direct military confrontation, haven't focused as much on naval development. The UAE also has a large amount of its crude going through the strait, which is 13% of the total export that goes through the strait. And more importantly, as much as 96% of the UAE's LNG exports go through Hormuz. So they have several major vessels that were, I think, acquired fairly recently. They have a couple of corvettes that were commissioned from France in the last 2 or 3 years, 6 indigenously designed corvettes, and around 42 patrol boats, I think. They've also been focused on unmanned systems for their navy and all of that. Then there's Oman's navy. And Oman is interesting because apart from Iran, they're the only other state in the region whose territorial waters include the state. And that gives Oman automatically much more legal and operational weight compared to the other powers, since much of the shipping lines go within Omani waters. So Royal Navy of Oman protects this huge coastline and helps with counter-smuggling in the area, especially the Musandam-Iran route has a lot of smuggling, so they focus on that. They typically haven't been involved in any operations against Iran, and they've maintained dialogue, so they're on relatively okay terms. Then there's Bahrain's Navy. And I think since Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet of the US Navy, their own Navy hasn't needed to modernize as much. And yeah, Bahrain's role in Hormuz largely is focused around providing the US access to NSA Bahrain and Khalifa bin Salman port, which are key to US operations, and then offer them some de facto protection.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, all the regional players and who have a stake in the region, there's also like a lot of importers who kind of depend on the strait for a lot of reasons, right? And there's a lot of massive economic mismatch as well, given that US only gets about like 2.5% of its crude through Hormuz. But if you look at a lot of Asian countries, especially India, they're deeply exposed by this crisis in the region, right? So, how do the specific energy risks and reserves differ among the most affected importers?
So the most affected importers, according to most analysis, are China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Because these are the countries who import crude as well as petrochemicals and fertilizers for their own facilities. According to most people, China is the largest importer from the strait. They receive the largest chunk of crude oil and condensate that goes through the strait at about 37%. And this is roughly half of China's total oil imports. Although China has huge crude imports from West Asia, they're also arguably very resilient compared to a lot of the other Asian importers because they have these massive petroleum reserves that I think are estimated to be over 1 billion barrels. And since they also have this vast pipeline network from Russia, as well as domestic production, they're less vulnerable. Additionally, because China is the largest buyer of Iran's own oil, Iran has this supposed green lane that they opened for China's tankers in the early days of the blockade. And of course, China also buys crude from all the other countries in the region. Then, of course, we come to India, which is the second largest destination of crude that goes through the strait, at I think about 14%, roughly. I'll have to check the numbers, but I'm reasonably sure. And there's reports that claim that as much as 60% of India's total crude oil imports come from the Strait of Hormuz, and as much as 53% of its liquid natural gas comes from Qatar and UAE through the strait. The thing is, because India also has substantial annual remittances from its diaspora in West Asia, it's become much more complicated because India has to try and balance its ties with these various countries. And additionally, on top of that, it imports urea and phosphate fertilizers. India has been trying to diversify its crude imports for the last couple of years by buying Russian and American oil, but it's relatively exposed to the uncertainty and the closure of the strait. And I think anecdotally, we all have some story of the other of how our transport is going up or how prices at small outlets near us have gone up. So I think people are starting to feel the crunch a little bit. A second order effect of India's fertilizer supply being impacted also could be hypothetically, there could be a strain on the supply of rice because India is a major exporter of rice and fertilizer is key to a lot of rice production. India exports, I think, 25% of total global rice exports. Although Japan only receives, I think, 10% of the overall crude that goes through Hormuz. A lot of its total crude imports and total oil supply come from West Asia. And all of this tends to go through the strait. 87% of Japan's energy comes from imported fossil fuels, and a lot of its electricity generation is reliant on LNG. Japan, it has about 4.4 million tons of LNG reserves, which approximately would last around 3-ish weeks, according to some people's imports. And of course, all of these estimates are based on what would happen if the supply was cut off completely. But right now, most countries, I think they are getting a diminished supply, and it's not as bad as it could be. Finally, of course, South Korea gets about 12% of the total crude that flows through Hormuz. But 70% of its total crude imports come from the region and 14% of its LNG. It's interesting also because its net oil imports are as much as 2.7% of its GDP, I think, which is very, very high compared to a lot of Asian countries. And it's vulnerable because a lot of its energy is reliant on these imported fossil fuels. And it has supposedly estimates of about 2 weeks of LNG reserves. But yeah, so of course, it's these countries who are affected the most. And the US, who's fighting this war and spearheading a lot of the attacks on Iran, actually has less of a stake in the game.
Yeah, going back to the impact on India, I think like you rightly mentioned, we do import a lot of our crude from the region, and I think LPG was a huge issue for a while in India until we did some changes in the structure of how we distribute it domestically. And like you mentioned, fertilizer, I think fertilizer again expected to have a lot of impact on the wholesale price inflation as well. I think I'm also not sure of the numbers, but expected to have some 1.02% hike in the wholesale price inflation in the next coming months itself. And even if the conflict ends very recently, I think it would have a prolonged effect on the Indian economy because of a lot of other things. And rupee has been falling plunging into the lowest historic lows, to be honest, and we're almost near the 100 mark against dollar right now. And I think since the war began, the rupee has weakened over 6% as well. So while we might not be looking at a balance of payment crisis at the moment, there's a lot of issues on how these tiny things would add up to a lot of impact on the economy. But yeah, we'll see. And like you mentioned, maybe if South Korea has 2 weeks of reserves, strategic reserves of oil, right? But I think India, when the crisis started, we had roughly less than 10 days of strategic reserves. So yeah, let's see how this is gonna kind of span out in the couple of weeks. But I think the impact on Indian economy might be much more prolonged and much more severe.
Yeah,
I guess. Anyway, thanks a lot, Adya. It was a really interesting discussion. Hoping to have you more to join us more on more discussions on these topics. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.